So thank you all so much for being here with us today. The symposium has been a wonderful convergence of academics, practitioners, students, and there's been already some great conversations today. I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker of the day, Sam Levine. Sam hardly needs an introduction to this room because in many ways he is one of the people responsible for putting this whole thing together. But we just had the minor inconvenience of losing him to the Mamdani administration before he could enjoy the fruits of his labor. Sam has had an extraordinary career. He led the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection, where he took on junk fees, privacy abuses, and a wide range of corporate misconduct. He now serves as commissioner of New York City's Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. Yeah. And he's somehow found a way to make consumer law more YouTube friendly and consumer friendly. And yes, I'm talking about his Taco Bell mukbang with, with Mayor Mamdani. This is a man who announced worker protection actions while filming a Taco Bell mukbang and who helped launch a case against Hungry Panda in front of actual red pandas. And this is the kind of visual metaphor that most lawyers can only dream of. And on a personal note, I am a Berkeley Law student and a student fellow with the Center of Consumer Law and Economic Justice, and I've had the chance to work directly with Sam. So I feel qualified to say that even though he's held some genuinely amazing positions, his best one was as a senior fellow at the Berkeley Law Center for Consumer Law and Economic Justice. That's the official position of the center, and I also believe the official position of the City of New York. So please join me in welcoming Sam Levine.
Well, thank you so much. That was not a misrepresentation. I loved my time at Berkeley. It is so wonderful to be back here. You know, there's nowhere quite like UC Berkeley, and I do mean that. I'm saying that even in front of my New York friends. This is a campus that has long served as a sanctuary for ideas and as a launch pad for change. And today, and I think it's apparent from all the great discussions we've already had, the need for new ideas and transformative change is greater than it's ever been before. In fact, I think it is urgent. As many of you know from my time at the FTC and since, I have deep concerns about surveillance pricing and wages, about a society where paychecks are set to the lowest you're willing to accept and prices are to the highest you're willing to pay. And I have deep concerns that we are already being told to accept this future, that the only way to preserve coupons and loyalty programs is to accept that companies can engage in mass surveillance of us, or that it's okay for employers to monitor workers' keystrokes and mouse movements on or off the job, so long as they click, "I agree." And I fear this is part of a broader trend in our society that worries me deeply. As we enter this period of rapid technological and economic change, we are being told what our future will look like. OpenAI recently published what is being called a new deal for the AI future, one where millions of workers are displaced and moved on to public benefits. As many have pointed out, it's a future where the only productive industries are theirs, depriving most of us of the dignity that comes with an honest day's work. Palantir offers a different kind of future. In its manifesto calling for a technological republic, power flows through a tight nexus of government and a handful of dominant tech firms, with AI, often in the military context, at the center. It's a vision that elevates technical authority over the messy, pluralistic process of democratic decision-making. These visions are distinct, but what they share is a premise that the future will be decided for us rather than by us. A future shaped by a handful of tech companies that were not elected, yet have bought their way into the corridors of power in DC, and sometimes in Sacramento, with the federal government bending over backward to not only give AI companies whatever they want, but trying to block states from imposing basic guardrails. It is no wonder that Americans are growing increasingly cynical about AI. Many of us were once excited by the prospect of life-saving cures and other breakthroughs. But poll after poll reveals the same conclusion. Americans are becoming pessimistic about AI. Even our youngest adults, the most likely to embrace this tech, are skeptical, worried about entering a workforce that AI leaders themselves say is primed for collapse. But I do have some good news. Americans are fighting back. fighting to reclaim agency in our own future. We see burgeoning efforts to ensure working people don't foot the bill for data center expansion, to protect kids and teens from harmful chatbots, to establish here in California and across the country basic AI safety standards. And in my view, one of the most important areas we see Americans pushing back is in the one we're gathered here to discuss. As David mentioned, today more than 24 states have proposed regulations on surveillance pricing. Superb research by Groundwork, American Prospect, Consumer Reports, and many others have generated national outrage, prompting some firms to actually deny that they plan to use surveillance pricing. Leading academics are raising the alarm and proposing interventions. And in one of my favorite moments, on the same day that my successor at the FTC mocked surveillance pricing as a concept that Lina Khan made up, the Republican chair of the House Oversight Committee announced a hearing on the topic, and he called it surveillance pricing. My friends, we are fighting back, and we are notching wins, not only raising consciousness of these practices, but shaping the political debate in Washington and in states and cities across this country. But of course, we are not here to declare victory. Because to truly reclaim control of our future, we need to relearn the lessons of the past and ensure that our policy and regulatory response can meet this moment. To that end, today I'll be revisiting how we approach digital regulation over the last quarter century as a cautionary tale for how we approach surveillance pricing today. I'll then offer an alternative, one that centers working people and democratic control over our economic future. And I'll share some examples of how we're working to build that future in the greatest city in the world, New York City. I know that all of us might feel some sense of defeat or even nihilism given what's happening in Washington and across the world. But I hope this symposium is but one step in a broader movement to reject oligarchy and reclaim agency to shape our economic future. But before we talk about where we're going, I think it's important to discuss how we got here. Surveillance pricing and wages did not emerge in a vacuum. As Stephanie Wynn has powerfully explained, the foundation for surveillance pricing is surveillance advertising, built on the same infrastructure, trained on the same insights, peddled by the same players. Tech companies first learned to predict what people wanted, then they learned how to get them to purchase, and now they're predicting what people will pay. Today, this trajectory might feel inevitable, but it wasn't. 25 years ago, at the dawn of Web 2.0, when Google was an upstart search engine and Amazon was mostly selling books, policymakers made a choice. At the time, the chairman of the FTC gave an important speech about how the agency would approach online privacy. He assured the audience that based on his conversations with tech executives, quote, industry will continue to make privacy a priority. And he praised the fact that a growing number of websites were posting privacy policies. Congress should stay out of the way of this tech revolution, he urged. Another FTC leader at the same time echoed this claim. He called for a 3-year moratorium on internet regulation and argued consumers needed to take more responsibility to protect their own privacy. Yet even as the FTC was extolling the promise of self-regulation, Google was discovering something else entirely, that by tracking people's searches, it could predict their behavior and target ads with extraordinary precision. As Shoshana Zuboff documents in her magisterial history, this in many ways was the birth of targeted advertising and of surveillance capitalism. Unfortunately, the policy response from Washington followed the FTC prescription to a T. Light touch regulation focused on empowering consumers to read privacy policies and click I accept. Oh, thank God. A massive explosion in identity theft, with policymakers blaming consumers who don't change their passwords enough. Tools like Do Not Call and Do Not Track that place the burden on consumers to protect themselves, with no meaningful consequences for firms that ignore them. An explosion of social media that's left a generation of kids scarred and isolated. Weak and myopic merger enforcement that allowed firms to consolidate power, especially over the ad ecosystem, with minimal scrutiny. This hands-off approach to privacy and merger control allowed the tech industry to grow so large that meaningful reform became nearly impossible. By the time Lena Khan arrived at the FTC, Julie Su and Seema at the DOL, Rohit Chopra at the CFPB, Jonathan Cantor at the DOJ, and the other, I think, heroes of the Biden administration, we knew that it would take enormous work to undo the damage. Yet despite major progress, that work is incomplete. So I know that this history is familiar to many of you, but I think it bears repeating because I don't want us to make the same mistakes again. I think we need to reject the idea that the solution to vast power asymmetries is more disclosure or more transparency tools. I don't want to live in a world where every consumer needs an agentic AI assistant to go toe-to-toe against sellers' surveillance pricing algorithm, a future that's already being marketed to us. I don't want to live in a world where workers need apps to simulate productivity while their employers' apps try to outwit them. No, we should not assume that the answer to bad tech is more tech. We should not assume that individuals can protect themselves against tools designed to manipulate and outmatch them. We tried that already. It didn't work. But this does not mean history doesn't offer us a model. As Professor Teachout alluded to earlier, I think we just need to look a little further back. So let's re-examine a different era, a time when we faced similar concentrations of power and responded by implementing bright-line structural rules. On the eve of our 250th anniversary as a nation, it's worth looking back over a century to the acceleration of the Industrial Revolution after the Civil War. It was an era of rapid technological and economic change, quite like this one, with the locus of power shifting from politics to industry. As thousands of miles of railroad tracks were laid down by immigrant workers, new possibilities emerged, and so did new forms of abuse. Of all the anti-competitive practices manufactured by railroad monopolies, one stood out: routinely charging different rates to different customers for the same service, favoring large industrial enterprises while imposing higher relative costs on farmers and small businesses. Marco Rubio moment here. These practices were often hidden, negotiated privately, shielded from public view. And they produced predictable results: economic stratification, political resentment, and a growing sense that the market was no longer operating on equal terms. Yeoman farmers and small businessmen were the most vocal critics of these disparate railroads. They saw how the railroads gave preferential treatment to those with the means to pay, and how power flowed along the contours of economic and racial lines. So what did they do? They organized, they mobilized, they fought for reforms. Their pressure campaign and Midwestern state legislatures worked, leading to Granger laws regulating freight rates and eventually leading to the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. The ICA didn't just establish that railroads had to offer reasonable and just transportation rates, it brought price fixing out of the shadows, banning secret beneficial rates to certain individuals. Rates were required to be published so everyone could see them. And this reform had a cascading effect. As we heard from Lindsay earlier, haggling was common in the late 1800s, with prices contingent and mercurial. But John Wanamaker, a department store in Philadelphia, introduced something radical: the Fitz price tag. One product, one price, visible to all. It was a technical quirk, but it was also a democratic reform. It created a shared economic reality, reducing information asymmetries and curtailing the ability of sellers to discriminate in the dark. And Congress didn't stop at the Interstate Commerce Act. 3 years later, in 1890, Senator John Sherman ushered through an antitrust act, further curbing railroads' monopolies' unilateral latitude to set shipping rates. I should note that these interventions did not stand alone. They rode alongside a surge of worker power, each reinforcing the other. As inequality widened, so too did the demand for change. Workers facing grueling conditions and unlivable wages fought for and won robust protections, from the 5-day workweek to the minimum wage. At the same time, a market rife with deception gave way to a new insistence on fairness, as institutions like the FTC were created to curb corporate abuse and elevate the everyday pocketbook concerns of ordinary people. So what did these reforms have in common? They were built on clear, enforceable rules, broad but not overly complex structural bulwarks, responsibility extended to those most able to bear it. And most importantly, a sensible balance of economic power, as decision-making was transferred away from the clutch of monopolists to the hands of those traditionally marginalized in our economy: factory workers, farmers, consumers, and small business owners. So I think this history speaks to the need to embrace an older, time-tested approach, ex-ante rules that set stable boundaries and allow markets and our communities to flourish. We have the tools developed over a century that establish popular, reasonable expectations: minimum wages, truth in pricing requirements, prohibitions on unfair, deceptive, and anti-competitive practices, and yes, constraints on price discrimination. Importantly, these tools do not require perfect knowledge of every algorithmic input. What they require are clear standards, public accountability, and critically vigorous enforcement. I am biased, but let me offer New York City as a model for how policymakers can actually deliver material gains for working people. Consider the experience of delivery workers in the Big Apple. The so-called gig economy, as we've heard about today, has been the staging ground for surveillance wages. And many responses have been floated, from third-party apps to help workers find the most lucrative offer, to new transparency and algorithmic accountability measures. And certainly these can be part of the toolkit. But if you ask most delivery workers in New York City the most important reform of the last decade, it's one you won't ever hear proposed by a tech company. It's the minimum pay rate, a concept that goes back more than 100 years. It says that whatever some algorithm might decide, workers are entitled to a minimum pay for all trip time and all time they spend waiting for a trip offer. This year, more than $22 an hour, and rising every year based on regulations set by our department. And when companies flout these regulations, we take action. On one day alone this year, we announced the recovery of nearly $5 million from Uber, Fantuan, and Hungry Panda for underpaying their delivery workers, and required Uber to offer reinstatement to thousands of workers because the company's algorithm decided they had canceled too many trips. Today, through clear-cut, bright-line rules, delivery work is more predictable, it's more stable, and it's more lucrative. In fact, we have raised deliveristas' wages by billions of dollars in New York City. And where apps used to pay workers $0 when they were waiting for a ride or waiting for an order, now they need to pay the minimum pay for that time too. Minimum pay is not the only example of how New York City is reclaiming an economic future shaped by workers instead of against them. Much has been written, we heard about it today, about how algorithmic scheduling burdens workers and their families. But in New York City, in two major industries, we guarantee a fair and predictable schedule, regardless of whether it's set by a boss or by bossware. Just last month, we announced nearly $2 million back to workers at Taco Bell, Dunkin' Donuts, and Theory, whose scheduling rights were violated. Much has been written about workers, especially so-called gig workers, losing their jobs because of the whims of an algorithm. In New York City, starting this year, we are prohibiting the deactivation, and Zephyr alluded to this, prohibiting the deactivation of drivers and delivery workers without cause. What does this mean? It means every worker deactivated will have a chance to appeal their termination first to the app, which must individually review the circumstances based on objective criteria, and if they don't like the outcome, they can appeal it to us, appeal it to New York City, where actual humans will evaluate whether workers were treated unfairly and deactivated unfairly. Much has been written about surveillance. Yeah. July 1st. Much has been written about surveillance pricing. But New York is joining states across the country advancing bills to ban the practice altogether. Much has been written about small businesses being ripped off by extractive app companies. In New York City, we have capped how much these apps can charge small businesses. And just 2 weeks ago, I was proud to stand alongside Mayor Mamdani and some adorable red pandas to announce the first ever actions returning money to small businesses, largely immigrant-owned restaurants that had been overcharged by app firms with bogus fees. These interventions have something in common. They are not based on empowering consumers with more disclosures or developing whiz-bang apps to help workers protect themselves. They are fundamental, basic, proactive safeguards. Safeguards that would have been recognizable to reformers a century ago, yet are more necessary than ever today. And the other thing these reforms have in common is that they were not decreed from on high in a tech company manifesto. No, in fact, tech companies fought these reforms every step of the way. We're still in litigation against most of these companies over most of these laws. And they can quote me in the litigation. Nor did these reforms emerge thanks to market forces that self-corrected, the FTC's now infamous excuse for decades of laissez-faire inaction. In fact, these reforms emerged thanks to workers organizing, marshaling political power, and passing historic legislation to raise their wages directly. Paired with the leader in Zoran Mamdani, committed to implementing this legislation fully and defending it against the onslaught of industry attacks, which we are. In New York City, we are not indulging the fiction that these problems are too new, too complex, or too technological for existing law. We are using the tools we have right now to set clear rules of the road. And when companies break them, we act. Our response will not be perfect on every issue, but as in another era of great progress, the New Deal, we are not waiting for perfect answers. Claims that problems are too complex for government are not analysis. They are an excuse for delay. And as we've seen for decades, delay favors those who want no government response at all. So I am proud of what we are doing in New York City. I am proud that consumers and workers and small businesses are coming together to fight emerging abuses and secure real gains for working people. And I am proud that we are proving something larger, that democratic government can still meet this moment. So I want to conclude by zooming out. When we are told again and again that this future is inevitable, that it is simply the natural result of technological progress, we should pause. We should remind ourselves that we have heard the story before. We heard it at the dawn of Web 2.0, when we were told that tech companies would self-police, that the public should find tools to protect themselves, that mass surveillance increased efficiency, and that innovation required passivity from policymakers. And we know where that led, to concentrated power, pervasive surveillance, and a generation of harms that are proving far harder to unwind than they would have been to prevent in the first place. Please, let us not make that mistake again. We should be especially wary, in my view, of sacrificing democratic control at the altar of efficiency. Efficiency, I ask, for whom? Efficiency, I ask, to what end? I do not want to live in a world where every interaction is stripped down to a transaction, where we are sorted, scored, and steered at every turn without ever being recognized as people rather than profiles, where work is parceled out by algorithm with no conversation, no discretion, no human connection, just a series of silent judgments about what each of us will accept. That may be more efficient, but it is a more austere, lonelier way to live. Because beyond a certain point, efficiency begins to erode something fundamental. It wears down trust. It fragments shared experience. It replaces a common price, a common wage, a common reality with something individualized, opaque, and ultimately unaccountable. And that is not just an economic problem, that is a democratic problem. Because democracy depends on fairness that people can see, rules that people can understand, and a sense that the system is not being quietly fine-tuned against them. That is what was at stake a century ago, and that is what is at stake again today. The lessons from the Gilded Age are not complicated. When power concentrates, we don't ask individuals to fend for themselves. We set rules, we draw lines, and we shift power back. That is the work ahead of us now. To reject the idea that this future is inevitable. To reject the idea that the only answer to bad technology is more technology. And to insist, clearly and unapologetically, that markets should serve people, not the other way around. Thanks very much. And now I think I take questions.
And so just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, please write them down on the note cards. I think Malia will be walking around and taking your questions. Thank you, Sam. That was a great speech. How's it being back in Berkeley?
It's great being back in Berkeley. Second greatest city in the world.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I will start with the first question I got. So you talked a lot about the history and the lessons we learned from the Gilded Age and past movements we've seen in our country. But I want to hear a little bit about what lessons you've learned so far in your position in New York City and how the academics and policymakers and consumer protectors in the room should think about cities as key sources of power for workers and consumers.
Yeah, well, I said it repeatedly, but I really want to underscore a key lesson I have learned from being in New York City and in my time at the FTC. I think there's a tendency, with all due respect and admiration for all the academics in this room, to respond to really complex problems with really complex solutions. Oh, we have to audit algorithms. We need to open the black box. We need, new agentic AI tools to be fiduciaries to consumers. Yeah, these ideas might have merit, but I, for one, don't believe that consumers are ever going to be able to be not outmatched by sellers. But more fundamentally, I just think if we let the solutions be that complex, they're just never going to happen. They're just never going to work. So one of the things I love about what we have done in New York City is that we are turning, again, I made this point, but I just want to underscore it. You don't have to overcomplicate this. You're worried about algorithmic wages? Set a minimum wage. You're worried about algorithmic pricing? Ban it. You're worried about algorithmic scheduling? Ban it. Force predictable scheduling. I think there are solutions that have been tried and tested in our history and today in New York City that we should really turn to. I forgot the second part of your question.
Yeah, it was, just how academics and policymakers and consumer protectors can use those lessons.
Don't overcomplicate it.
Yeah.
Just don't overcomplicate it. And in terms of cities, yes, I think cities have become the laboratories for democracy. We know the famous Brandeis quote around states. But I think cities you look what's happening in San Francisco, look what's happening in Seattle. I think cities can very much be laboratories for democracy. And I think if you look what's happening in New York City, I really do believe that this is a model for the rest of the country. Clear minimum pay, clear predictable scheduling rates, which we're going to expand this year. We are tangibly raising the living standards for workers in ways that I don't think is happening anywhere else in America.
Yeah, thank you. And the second question I have is actually kind of a follow-on. And you mentioned some other cities and how they can be laboratories for change. But do you think in this age where the federal government is absent, do you think there's a chance for cities to work together to get more political power and direct market changes by banding together? Yeah,
I think cities can band together. I can tell you that, we introduced a tool a couple months ago now to help workers and evaluate whether So we have a law in New York City called Protected Time Off, guarantees time off for all workers. But the problem is that many employers offer time off on paper, but the culture of the employer, the culture of the job is such that most workers can't actually take advantage. So we introduced a tool people can use to actually look at, I won't get into the details of it, but to actually help enforcers analyze whether protected time off is a reality for folks in the workplace. And I can tell you, we have shared that with cities all over the country. And I think that's an example of how cities really can be engines of policy innovation. And I know that we have very regular conversations with San Francisco, with Seattle, with Chicago, with other cities around the country that are working to raise living standards and looking to New York as a model.
Okay, amazing. And then a question that I had, and this is a thread I think that we saw through the first two panels, but a lot of the discussion around surveillance prices and wages has been around, I guess, communication and how these clandestine practices, how do people become aware of them, and how do we get people to care about them? And in the New York City government has become famous for its communication style and connecting with constituents. How do you think communication and the lessons you've learned about communication can affect how we approach surveillance prices and wages?
Yeah, well, it's been the true joy of the last few months to be able to have a mayor who's probably, as a communicator, the most talented official in the world. No offense, where's David? Or Seligman. He's pretty good too. But I think the mayor's the most, and to use that as a way to empower workers. I mean, people joke a lot when we're eating the crunch wrap, but we were talking about fair work week protections. That's what we were talking about. Yeah, we talked about whether we like the crunch wrap, we talked about whether we like the Mexican pizza, but there was a metaphorical salad there as well, which was educating workers about fair work. We got a surge of complaints from workers after we did that announcement. After we did the Hungry Panda announcement, we got more complaints from small businesses. Communicating, these laws are only work, if you have enforcers willing to enforce them, but also people need to know what their rights are. I think there's this perception, not in this room, that government is omniscient and knows when violations are happening. We don't. We need to hear from people. And I think what's so great about what's happening in New York is not only are we hearing from more people, I think that is a way of restoring people's faith in democracy. When you actually see the mayor of New York saying, here, we're handing out checks to Taco Bell workers because they didn't have a predictable schedule. And if you're having the same problem, you should file a complaint and New York City will act. There's something really meaningful about that, of showing people who don't get a lot of attention in Washington, who don't have a lot of power in the marketplace, that their needs matter and the New York City is backing them up. So I think communicating these rights is just as important as enforcing them. And I think it's another way where the mayor is really setting the tone.
Okay, thank you. And so one question from the audience that kind of is a follow-on to this thread on communication. It's a specific question. When will New York City launch its own municipally governed app for rideshare and delivery?
Well, I can't get ahead of the mayor and back to my old. Last year, I could say whatever I want. As a senior fellow, I could say whatever I wanted and just hope Ted wouldn't fire me. But
best job in the world.
I'm a little more constrained now. Look, I think we need to have serious conversations about bringing back public goods, public banking. Obviously, in New York City, we're now launching public grocery stores. The mayor made a major announcement a couple weeks ago. Another really forceful intervention that has worked in the past is simply saying this should be a public good. It's a really clear way to shut out the exploitation that we've been talking about all day. So to be continued on that conversation.
Amazing. Okay, and the next question I have is on surveillance prices and wages specifically. What research gaps do you see in the field, and practically what evidence would help your work and maybe promote legislation that you want to pass and promote the lawsuits that you want to take on?
I think there's great research underway. I mean, American Prospect, Groundwork, Consumer Reports, the Instacart study, the Uber study on More Perfect Union. I mean, I hope I said this, but it is astounding to me. I mean, when Stephanie and I and our team at the FTC really where's Stephanie? Led by Stephanie. We couldn't even get folks inside the FTC. Well, I shouldn't reveal it. It was a fight to call it surveillance pricing. And now this is a term that everyone is, thank you, Zephyr. This is now a term everyone is using. Even Chamber of Progress is now resigned to using. This is actually resonating with people. And look, experimentation to show higher prices and differential. This is great, but I also think we should listen to, as many panelists point out, our own moral intuitions about this. I don't think we need to wait for the perfect economic study to say, no, we don't want to live in a world where you can charge higher prices to someone because of their race or their religion or their purchase history or their location. I think there's a moral intuition there that is right, and that should be reflected in the law.
Okay, and the next question I have is, it talks about gig companies like Uber and Lyft. They're masters of loopholes, and they've met wage floors with increased unpaid wait times, deactivations to continue predatory practices. How can we get to a point where we proactively stop abuses rather than having to regulate each abuse piece by piece?
Well, look, there is something to that. I think it might feel like a cat and mouse game. But the reality is New York City, in the battle between New York City workers and these app companies, guess who's winning? New York City. You know, when the city implemented a minimum pay rate last year, you know what Uber and DoorDash did? They moved the tipping interface, they used a dark pattern, to move the tipping interface to after checkout. It cost New York City workers more than $500 million. A study released by our department blew the whistle on this. It cost New York City workers more than $500 million in tips, more than $5,000 for every delivery worker. So we changed the law. We said, no, you have to put your tipping up front. And I don't want to get ahead of our wonderful staff, but we're going to release a report in a couple of weeks showing that, guess what? Tips are way up. Because at the end of the day, New Yorkers, it is my strong conviction. You know, DoorDash goes around saying tipping's a tax, consumers are tired of it. The data does not bear that out. New Yorkers, you know, we had some of the worst blizzards in New York City history this year. And the only people on the streets were our deliveristas. They were the ones braving the snow and the ice while the rest of us waited in the comfort of our homes. New Yorkers recognize that. New Yorkers recognize what a dangerous job they are doing, and New Yorkers want to reward it with tips. So I really believe, yes, it is a cat and mouse game, but in a city where you have a council committed to worker justice, a mayor committed to worker justice, you can beat them.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Sam. And this is the final question of the keynote portion of the symposium. So this is, I think, on the thread of the lack of federal enforcement. You've talked a lot about how New York City has stepped up, and cities have stepped up, states have stepped up. But this question asks, how do private rights of action play into all of this?
Well, I'm very proud of our enforcement track record at DCWP, but we are vastly under, and New York is very lucky because we have the best, and Chris is here, we have the best attorney general in the country. I'm sorry, Californians, but New York is the best attorney general in the country. And I think we have a great Department of Consumer and Worker Protection in the city. But both offices are deeply under-resourced. There is no, and I was at the FTC, the FTC is deeply under-resourced. Seth's article is so important, 10,000 more corporate cops. There will never be enough resources at administrative agencies to redress all of these harms. And the effect of that isn't just fewer dollars in people's pockets. It's more companies that think they can get away with ripping people off because they know there aren't enough cops on the beat. Everything we know about deterrence from the criminal context, we seem to forget when it comes to corporate crime. But the exact same principles apply. If there's not strong deterrence, you're not going to have strong compliance. So that's where I think a private right of action is so critical. Oh, but corporations are trying to get around that, we know, with arbitration clauses. And here again, let's look to our cities. Let's look, where's Adam? Let's look to Washington, D.C., which has established organizational standing so that, all of you saw Consumer Federation of America sued Meta for earning tens of billions of dollars off scam ads. Guess what tool they used? Organizational standing. That's why they're not being forced into that's why Meta will try, but they will lose, forcing CFA into arbitration. So I think a private right of action is critical, but we also need to think really creatively about how we circumvent this effort to bury these cases in arbitration and actually get workers and small businesses and consumers their day in court.
Okay, here. Who else is inspired?
Thank you.
Can we get a round of applause for our keynote speaker, Sam Levine?